So now it's a pleasure for me to introduce Tara and Winona. So Tara Thompson, and she uses the pronouns she and her. She's the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Okanagan Regional Library. Among many other system projects, she has a focus on access services, which includes promotion of accessible collections, including CELA and NELS, coordinating various library programs, and she leads the selection service for their print disabled customers. Winona McMorrow, whose pronouns are she and her, is a librarian who serves as the Senior Services Specialist for Accessibility Services at Toronto Public Library. Accessibility Services provides and promotes accessible library collections, services, and equipment for people who are deaf and people with disabilities. So we'll get started, and I'll ask Tara to begin and tell us about her staff training at the library.
Hi everyone. I don't think we're nearly as popular as Toronto and may not know where we are. So we're located in the interior of British Columbia, about a 4 or 5 hour drive east of Vancouver. We cover about 59,600 square kilometers, or as my supervisor likes to say, we cover the geographic size of Ireland. So we're a very large area that we cover. We have 31 different branches, and we're the 16th largest library system in Canada. And our branches are urban branches, but we go all the way down to a one person, about the size of your bedroom kind of branch in Oyama, or I think Headley is actually part of the community. They just open up a cupboard and that's their branch for the day. So when we're thinking about our staff training, we have geographic area is one of our biggest barriers that we're dealing with. Our staff, our supervisors only meet together twice a year at max, really, because we've got 16 hours of driving between the farthest branches. So, and a lot of our branches, we need to plan and budget for overnight stays for those meetings. So geographic area is a huge barrier for us. And then of course, like every other library, we don't have a lot of time for our staff to be attending trainings, or like each of our branches has different open hours. So we don't even have times when the branch isn't open that we can just get together whichever way. So that's where we're coming from training. Accessibility is fairly new focus for us. I was hired into this position in 2016, very first person in this position, and just get thrown projects to work on as we get there. So we know in 2016 that this was going to be something, but we didn't really get started on accessibility a lot until 2019. We also know, and the BC government just announced legislation yesterday that we've both only seen on Twitter so far, to finally BC having some accessibility legislation. So we kind of knew it was coming. We wanted to emphasize a bit more and try to get ahead of ourselves, get ahead of the legislation to get ourselves prepared for what would be needed. So last fall, we ended up participating in some we've missed a year. 2019 fall, we participated in some community consultations for that legislation. So we joined some community groups and some individual people to put on that workshop type thing to just talk about the legislation and what should come from there. And then again, we had our very first staff member that's just focused on accessibility issues, and she started March of 2020. So our plans then were to focus more on getting customers in, but because everything got shut down, we couldn't do that. So we kind of shifted into more, how can we train and get our staff ready when we get opened back up again? So we had a bit of an opportunity because all of a sudden we had time to explore Microsoft Teams and how we might be able to run programming virtually, which we've never had the time to explore doing virtual programming like that. So we came up with that. So one of the big things we did last year for training was we put on a series of sessions. We called them like micro training. So we only aimed for them to be 15 or 20 minutes, because at that point, all of the we've been back open We started curbside in May, I think, last year, and then branches have been open full hours in the summer, August, in July or August, I think. So we've been completely open. So we're back to no time to do anything. So in the fall, we did these micro training sessions. We had 5 different sessions. They're only 15 or 20 minutes. So hoping that people could be able to carve out 15 or 20 minutes in their day to participate. We did, our first session was on just introduction to accessibility. So an introduction to the idea of disability theory and how we're changing our thoughts around disability. We included a little bit on universal design and how it's been sneaking up and we're used to that, but maybe not thinking of it in that way. We did an introduction just to print disability and where the Canadian Copyright Act comes into it and that sort of thing. And then our selection service. So that's where that staff member, our library access assistant, is picking books specific to what a person needs. Very similar to what CELA does for some customers. And then we did just a sharing session, 15-20 minutes, because some of our branches have been doing services like that, but this is the first time we've taken a system view from it. So we just wanted to see if branches had something to share that we could all learn from. Since the fall, we've continued to do just like monthly emails as a reminder, this is the news, this is what's coming up. Because I think we've all experienced that where we've had a training and then we don't encounter it again for 6 months and we've kind of forgotten things. So we're just trying to do little bits that we can connect people to and remind them of processes and do that sort of stuff. We also, in the last 3-4 years, we revamped how we bring in staff. So we used to do individual, each branch would do its own on-call training for our on-call staff that would come in. And we now do system-wide training. So we're able to make sure that certain points are included in all of our training. So our accessibility thoughts and print disability is interwoven within that onboarding training, circulation reference training. That's all done. I think it's 4 days that they spend, or maybe it's a full week now. We keep adding stuff into it so that it gets bigger and bigger. In the future, what we're hoping to do is start to train staff on the accessibility features in an iPad and an iPhone so that if customers come to them, they have some resources that they can give them, or they have some idea how to play with their iPhone or iPad to explore those features. So that's where we're at. We're fairly new on the training side, but we're kind of proud of our 5 sessions that went really well in the fall and see what else we can learn from everybody else here.
Great. Thank you very much, Tara. We'll just take, I see there's one question for you, and it is, are your training videos available for others to see? So I guess more.
So we recorded a number of them and then picked the best one that we could. Got the closed captioning correct and fixed all that up. It's currently available for ORL staff. I can check and see if we can share those out if you want to. Probably, I don't know the best way to do that.
Probably if you share it with, unless it's Brian, oh, it's okay. So you can send it to me and I can pass it along, and I know Brian, so I can pass it to him individually, or if there's, or I can include it when I send out sort of any additional information after the session. So.
Yeah, and it was co-hosted with the two of us, so I might have to double check with my co-host. So at the very least, I can definitely share the outline of what we covered. I just need to check with a couple people if we can share it out first.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions for Tara? And you're welcome to unmute yourself and just ask the question aloud if you like. No. Okay, so I think we'll move on to Winona.
Okay, hi, thanks. That was great. I really enjoyed hearing about those initiatives. I like the idea of the short sessions. That's really appealing. So yeah, thanks for having me here today to talk about accessibility and training. I work at Toronto Public Library, which is a big library system in Ontario. It's big. We have 100 branches across the city, and I think something like, well, more than 2,000 full-time equivalent employees. I think that's right. So it's a big system, lots of different people, lots of different needs. When I think about how we include accessibility in our staff training, which is one of the questions that was posed for discussion today, the first thing that I think about is, training topics on accessibility. And we try to offer a range of accessibility topics in a mix of different formats. So prior to the pandemic and our closure, we, of course, were doing in-person workshops, but also we've tried to do short webinars and then longer sessions or even courses over a few weeks, perhaps. Of course, everything is online now, so that's changed quite a bit. And there are lots of advantages and challenges to that, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So over the last few years, I've been in this position since December, I think, 2017. It was a newly created position at the time, accessibility services. So since that time, we've done lots of different types of training. We've done mandatory training. Here in Ontario, we have legislation that requires mandatory accessibility training, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, AODA, and of course we have the Ontario Human Rights Code too. So we have mandatory training around that. And then we have had training for specific staff groups. For example, last year we had, oh my gosh, again, it wasn't last year at all. It was the previous year. Anyway, we had a short-term work group looking at accessibility for children, and that group developed an afternoon-long workshop about including children and families who are deaf and or have disabilities at the library. And the group did some consultation with local service agencies too in order to develop that training. And working with local services and agencies, I think, is really important for accessibility training, and we've tried to do that as well. So we've done training on deaf culture and basic ASL in partnership with the Bob Rumble Canadian Centre of Excellence for the Deaf. We've done blindness awareness training, sort of sensitivity training perhaps, which was an in-person workshop with a local organization called Balance for Blind Adults. And then we've brought in training, online training, like short webinars on sensory story time, or introductions to ASL from ALA, e-learning. They have some modules. And as well, our training department recently worked with their counterparts at the City of Toronto so that we could offer some of the city's training, most recently for online modules, including an Accessibility 101 module. So that's pretty great. And of course, CELA workshops. So we were fortunate to work with Faylene from CELA to do an in-person workshop a few years back now. And then we've been offering the online webinars as well. So this question though also made me think about work we're doing to incorporate training about accessibility into training on other subjects, as Tara was saying, sort of incorporating it into the kind of core training. And that happens in a few ways. We have a user education committee that has an annual conference with a different theme each year. And one year they chose accessibility as the theme. So that was a nice opportunity, I think, for staff working on, staff who do computer classes, for example, to think about accessibility in that context and to think about their work from an accessibility perspective. More recently, we had an online programming work group to develop training to support staff who are doing our online programs. And they developed a series of online modules on various topics, and one of them was about accessibility, how to make online programs more accessible. But then in thinking about this question, another thing for me is about, how do we make sure that the training itself is accessible? Because we want to ensure that all of our staff can access and participate fully in our training. So we want to be able to provide, for example, captioning and recordings, live captioning for live sessions for staff who need it, be they deaf, hard of hearing, if they have difficulty with auditory processing, for anyone who benefits from live captioning. We also want to be able to provide ASL interpretation upon request. And it's important too that our online trainings are compatible with assistive technology that some of our staff use, such as JAWS screen reader software or Zoom text magnification software. And then when we're creating online modules, which we're starting to do more of now, we want to make sure that those modules have all those accessibility features like narration, captioning, transcripts, and so on. And then it's also very helpful when we can provide recordings afterwards of live sessions, as well as slides or handouts if they were available, and then ensure that those documents, those materials are accessible. So recordings with captions, documents formatted for accessibility, and so on. In terms of the frequency of the training, there's always lots of movement at the library. Staff change positions and responsibilities. And of course, there are constantly new developments and new things happening in the accessibility space. So right now, we do have a core suite of accessibility training modules that's mandatory for all staff to take. And that's set now for everyone to take every 3 years, I think. So they must take it when they start at the library and then once again every 3 years. And this is a legislated requirements training. It's covers the basics around the legislation and then accessible customer service, accessible information and communications, accessibility at TPL, those sorts of things. In addition to that, we also have other accessibility training that I just mentioned, and that's offered on an ongoing basis. It's not mandatory. I think we would like to develop future trainings that would be offered on an ongoing basis. For example, digital documents training is something that we'd like everyone to have. I also really like Tara's, you mentioned training around how to use accessibility features in mobile devices. I think that would be really beneficial for our staff too when they're helping our patrons. In terms of setting goals, when I have been setting goals relating to training and accessibility, I've tried to consider a few things. One, of course, what do we need to do to meet our legislated requirements? So the big picture things, legislation, to ensure that our training is aligned with our strategic plan and the goals around that, and also aligned with our learning and development goals. We have a newly formed learning and development committee, and they have established some goals working towards a learning culture at TPL. So I try to ensure that the training that we're developing fits with those big picture pieces. And then, of course, want to make sure we meet specific staff needs. So, you know, if I get a lot of questions about service animals, I want to put together a session on that topic with partners in the community. Another example there is some staff who've taken some of the basic ASL training that we've offered have said, you know, they'd like to have chances to practice with each other because it's a language. You lose it quickly if you don't have chances to practice. So I've been working with them to try to develop a staff ASL practice group. One of the questions posed for discussion today was about barriers in staff training. And there are a few around accessibility. I would say for us, we are lacking a process for providing accessibility accommodations to staff in our trainings. We have accessibility issues with some of our online platforms and our tools. So at TPL, we use WebEx as our online meeting platform and a training platform. And it has some limitations, accessibility limitations for staff who use JAWS or other assistive software. It's also a challenge because if I would like, as I would like to invite someone who is blind and uses JAWS to deliver training on service animals, for example, there are some barriers with our training platform. So we need to find ways to work around that. We also don't have, I think, as much captioning software as I would like to make our WebEx recorded WebEx sessions accessible, as well as PowerPoint video recordings. That is one way we're developing modules. Some staff have access to Articulate Storyline to do modules, which is great, and it does have lots of accessibility features, but you do need to know how to use them correctly so that the module you create is accessible and to avoid having elements that aren't accessible in your training, like matching exercises as knowledge checks, which don't work well with screen readers. So in order to overcome some of those barriers, we're working on, several resolutions. We want to develop a system-wide process for providing staff accommodations. We want to develop some standards and guidelines for virtual and non-instructor-led training. And then addressing accessibility issues with our platforms and our tools is a bigger picture work in progress, I think. There have been lots of challenges and learning opportunities in this pandemic year. Pivoting to online learning has brought a lot of opportunities and challenges. One real opportunity is that our training department was actually just working on planning the launch of an online learning management system so that we could do more online learning. And they did an incredible job of moving all their timelines way up to get that system up and running so that we could keep staff engaged and working from home while our branches were closed. As well, being able to offer more online training has made it possible to open up opportunities for staff who wouldn't be able to take it otherwise because of geographic challenges. Not 16 hours, but it can take an hour or two to cross the city of Toronto, depending on what traffic is like. It's always difficult to get out of the branch. So that's really a positive for online training. But of course, there's lots of challenges too, like the barriers that I noted before. There are opportunities here, including ensuring that training materials are available in accessible formats prior to a training session, and letting staff know that they can request those materials in accessible formats, and ensuring that staff know how to provide those materials in accessible formats. So, the training there is around, or the opportunity there is around developing accessible digital document training. And guidelines on giving accessible presentations and so on. And overall, I think there's an opportunity to kind of reconsider how we do training in the first place and review what we're developing and designing and how we might make it more accessible and inclusive overall by following those principles that, again, Tara mentioned around like universal design for learning and so on. And the last thing I'd like to say is at TPL, I'm so fortunate for many reasons. One of them is we have our library leadership recognized the need to address accessibility system-wide, and so we've recently hired an accessibility manager who is helping to lead some of these system-wide projects and helping to facilitate conversations around how to make our training and many other things more accessible for staff and public at TPL. So I'm really excited about that. And I sought his input in some of these talking points today. So if you're here, Darren, thanks for all of those notes that I just read out. And that's all I have to say right now. I'd love to hear any questions that people might have or comments. You can put them in the chat or unmute yourself. Either way is fine with me.
I will mention we have an ASL conversation group that's on Saturday that your staff would be more than welcome to join. I'll send you the link after.
Thank you. That would be amazing.
Thanks, Winona. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. But this is the time. I think Darren may want to speak. I just saw a hand up. Just a second. There is a question in the chat, but Darren, go ahead.
No, I was just applauding Winona. I wasn't asking a question, but I'm glad, Winona, that you asked me to help, and I was happy to provide answers to your questions.
Thank you so much, Darren. I'm glad you could be here today.
Thank you. I'm learning a lot. This is great.
So the question in the chat is, do you have a lot of staff needing accessible support through JAWS? So I think this is directed at Winona.
Yeah, good question. I don't know if we have a lot of staff. We do have, many staff in the system, and a lot is relative. But we do have some staff who require that support. And therefore, you know, we want all of our staff to have access to all of the training opportunities that their coworkers have access to. So it's important, I think, for that reason. And then, you know, there may also be staff who don't disclose their disability. And so other kinds of disabilities, you know, we just want to ensure that what we're doing is as inclusive and accessible for everybody. Yeah.
And same for us. I don't know if there's any staff that need it or not. I mean, HR would have that information, not necessarily. And especially for us, we're so spread out. I have no idea who works sometimes in the Osoyoos branch. I'm not sure what needs that are there. But I do think it's important that when there's fairly easy things that you can do, just turning on the automatic captioning when we're using Teams in meetings, I don't think it's fair to expect people to have to disclose something in order to be able to participate. And I think in terms of conferences and when we get back to in-person stuff, when there's a microphone, use the microphone. You don't know if that's helping somebody with a hearing issue or hearing aid, or maybe it's hooked up to the hearing loops. You don't know, but use the microphone. Use the accessibility tools that are there. And I know, like, captioning, especially here, if I've got a lot of background noise, if we're working from home, the captioning helps me understand what's going on as well. I turn them on TVs because the background noise is too loud, right?
Yeah.
For sure. I'm hoping it's okay that I've unmuted. I find it's really difficult to get people out of the accessibility is an afterthought mindset. I find that it's a huge challenge. People don't see the barriers, and when you have to sort of mention them to them, and I find that can be really a challenge. I know a lot of our training and a lot of our stuff has come to a halt because of course, everything going on with the pandemic. But yeah.
And I have, like, we're not perfect. I listen to Winona and I'm like, I could do that, we could do that, we need to do that. But I know that we're just at the start, and you got to start somewhere, and a lot of this can feel uncomfortable, but I think that's fine. Be uncomfortable, know it's missing, and make little steps as you can towards something. So another thing that's just on my head is, can I teach the staff that I have how to actually use Word properly with headings and using the styles, just so that if a screen reader is getting used, it can be used properly.
Yeah, I find I'm often the advocate because of course I'm also a print disabled person. So I'm like, I have to be both the person helping provide accessibility services, but also the advocate. And that's a difficult role because it's like, you know, you understand the need, and that can be really difficult because you're just like, okay, you know, this is super important, and I don't know how to stress that any more than I have.
Absolutely, that's a good point. Then maybe what we'll do is does anyone else have experiences to share in terms of their staff, let's put it this way, staff awareness of disabilities, and within that, if you have staff who do have disabilities and that say have disclosed those disabilities, can maybe we have a bit of conversation based on that and other experiences? And again, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah, of course, I've got a lot of those experiences too, but I'll let someone else speak for a while.
Looks like you're up, Rachel.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Again, just being both that point person in both those ways can be challenging because you're trying to stress and advocate for the user, but also for yourself. And that can be super hard. And so If we have, for example, we are operating in a unionized environment, and so roles can be tied to certain things like your job. But then if you have a job and you're not allowed to do something because of your role, how do you separate that from the person who is a disabled individual wanting to advocate for disability services? And so that can be a difficult connection to make and difficult bridge to cross, right? So, so additional challenges. But pardon me, sorry, I have a bit of a cough, not COVID related. And so what we've done is I was with Rachel and we did a presentation at OLA in 2020, and since then we rolled out a whole bunch of things that we did prior to that presentation and also following after. And then of course COVID hit, and it seemed to be, and this is no fault of our organization, of course, this is just the way things are, but it's like, you know, that became less important, right? Like this issue is not as important as all these other prevailing things that are happening around us. And so, so a lot of that stuff came to a halt. And what we were doing is originally we were going from, we have 18 branches. I work for Mississauga. And so what we were doing is, as teams of 2 presenters, we were going to each of the 18 branches and doing these hour-and-a-half info sessions and talking, because the vast majority of staff don't know sometimes all that we have. And so there's a big education piece about, okay, here's everything we do have access to, and not just CELA, but, you know, here's what is possible within, you know, the realm of possibility. And so, and I was working at our virtual call center during this for about I guess about 3 months or so when we were closed to the public. And of course, I was continuing my role of helping people with their device management, helping people with their with how to use their Android or iPhone with Easy Reader, or having to use screen readers and which to download and so on and so forth, or which come with the operating system automatic. So doing all that technical stuff while doing the virtual call center, but of course that is over now. So yeah, I do still get occasionally users coming to me or recommending to me. Right now, everything is decentralized because we also have a big renovation happening. So we're hoping to get things kind of like we kind of, I know the end goal is to have things to be kind of decentralized so that everyone can get virtually equal services no matter where they go. But we're definitely not there yet. And I'm looking forward to this today I'm writing notes furiously about where can we go and what are our options down the road and how can we develop this. And there seems to be a lot of really great ideas. But I have been working, and a lot of us were working on a lot of things like accessible documentation for different kinds of software and things that for assistive workstations and things like that. So there's just so much work to do. So so that's kind of where we're at. Yeah, it's just it's coming along.
Those sound like amazing efforts, Rachel. I'm just going to lead off on one thing that Rachel said. So when Rachel mentioned the session that we did at OLA last year, and what became apparent to all of us, because we were a panel, is that the number one item to make your library accessible basically was making sure staff were aware of accessibility practices and welcoming people in. So that's one of the reasons why here at CELA we decided to offer this this user group discussion about staff training, because we knew just how valuable that was, and it's really the heart, I would say, of accessible library services. So leading on, does anyone else have any experiences to share about accessibility and staff training? So maybe I'll just open it up. What are, if you have done some staff training, what are your successes and what have been some barriers? So I'll take, I'm not sure if the silence is everyone's just here to learn, or if you're just not, you're not sure kind of what you've already done and how that might apply here. Oh, yes, great. So Audrey, go ahead if you want to unmute yourself or speak.
Hi there. Hope everyone's having a great day. I'm Audrey. I'm the supervisor of the Carnegie Branch Library of the Vancouver Public Library. We've been here since about August, since we were closed for several months over the beginning of the lockdown. And myself and my wonderful colleague Marita are here, and we're in the middle of developing and sort of revamping. I guess we're starting off with, well, we're from the patron-centered service team, which is basically a customer service basic training for all staff, particularly, centered towards brand new folks joining our organization. And yeah, we're really thinking about how the format, how the process will look for everybody. This is basically going to be the first online training that's hitting the system. And I think one thing that has landed really well with Marita and I is that we're kind of in awe of what's been going on out there. And I think our organization has spent a lot of time and focus thinking about accessibility and how it relates to our patrons. And the majority of our work and our focus is training staff on how we can be empathetic and thinking about those kinds of needs. But I think we're really falling short on how to do that for ourselves and how to do that for our own staff. And this is, I think, going to be such a good opportunity. And what I'm struck by is that we're having this chance to sort of create something new. And this is a way to think about how online can actually be a huge bonus in terms of folks who, for example, they're in a room and people's voices are low and there's like a HVAC going on. They may not be able to hear super well. And maybe our new online learning management system will be able to provide closed captioning, or we're thinking about lots of the same things that everyone else has talked about here, like shorter little pre-recorded videos, or splitting our training up into smaller sections, or any of those kinds of, so much to think about. I'm just really blown away. So thank you so much for recording the session so we'll be able to go back and really look in detail about what's been going on. But we have an incredible Department of Accessible Services that is doing tons of work for our patrons and really kind of meeting those needs. And I think that what we really need to do is talk to those folks and start bringing some of those things back into our own staff-related training. I mean, I'm even seeing in the last few months how we're really pushing to make sure that we have the technology and the devices in order to be able to communicate past all the mask barriers with our patrons, and assisted listening devices and all those types of things. But why are we not turning that lens back inwards to our own organization and thinking about how to really use those same tools in a larger blanket way? So thank you very much. We're learning a lot.
Great, thank you, Audrey. So there's another question. It's given that provinces have legislated accessibility, have your libraries provided adequate budgets for you to get what you need done? That's an excellent question. So open the floor for that one.
So I'll go first. We don't have legislation in BC. It's just announced it's going to be entered into the House at some point, and we'll be able to read what they're planning. So there isn't much of a requirement for us to do anything at this point. So anything we're doing right now is more, we know it's coming. We'd like to start changing the culture now before we're forced to, in a way. I mean, we have the Human Rights Act. Sorry, I don't remember what it's called in BC. So there's those thoughts, but we don't have a requirement right now for our board minutes to be available accessibly. It should be, I think it should be, but right now we don't. And so I have a very small budget, and it is one full-time person, which is our library access assistant, and then me, but I'm spread out through many different projects as well. So I hope that answers that question.
That's great. Anyone else in terms of budgets to offer accessible training? Oh, and Rachel, you're on mute.
I just posted there are some grants that are available to help your different organizations. There's some for private and some for public that are, I know there's some that are provincial, that if you're in Ontario, I'm sure there's other provinces that have them as well. So I know that some of our accessibility funds came from applying for grants, and I think that is that's a sort of a necessity. I think there definitely is going to be a man or a person power component, and then there's going to be a technology component that's going to cost your organization money, obviously. And I think that investigating grants is like the first step, right?
Good point. And thank you, Rachel, for posting the links. It's to an Ontario resource page of grants, but still I think useful to know about. Absolutely. Any other comments about budgets in particular? So we've been doing these training sessions at CELA for, or user group sessions for a while. And I remember one comment from a library, and it was to add accessibility as an agenda item on all staff meetings, essentially. That way it's never forgotten. It's up in front with all the other priorities that your library offers. So I'm just wondering, do libraries already include accessibility in meeting agendas? Is that something you would think about doing? Any comments? Yeah, so Rachel's saying, is that something that she would consider doing?
This is Winona speaking. We're not doing that at TPL, but I think it's a great idea because it extends accessibility into the work that everybody is doing across the organization. Was it Audrey who was talking about, knowing that you have coworkers who have lots of knowledge about certain things? How can you kind of connect what they're doing with what you're doing? I don't know. I feel like having those opportunities just to talk about accessibility at every table is really valuable. I don't think I'm making much sense. There are two thoughts here. Somehow they will come together as one at some point, maybe not in this moment. But I love the idea of putting accessibility as an agenda item for all kinds of different groups for consideration.
What you said was crystal clear to me, so I imagine others thought understood you as well. Great. So any other items to share? We're getting close to our finishing time, but I definitely want to encourage you to ask questions, considering both Tara and Winona have, both their systems have put in quite a bit of thought into training. There is a question that's come through. So it is, what is a good first step to increasing accessibility within the library and for staff training? After our local CNIB office closed, we seem to lose access to the important resources they provided. So that brings in, I think that's great. And I know some of you already mentioned this, but connections in the community to associations that serve people with disabilities. So just open it up, first steps, and maybe a bit about connections.
I'll just mention for connections, it doesn't have to be the organizations as well. If you can find individuals, because we have one individual who works for the Neil Squire Society who happens to, but just to take a tour of your library with a blind individual who can talk about things that I would have never thought about. So we went on a tour of our Kelowna branch, which is a 2-story building, and he pointed out that there's a big opening and it's got glass all around the outside that doesn't go directly to the floor. And every time he uses his white cane, he knocks the glass, which makes him feel very embarrassed to be on that floor, to be using his cane to find out where things are at. So just even to find an individual that you can just kind of learn how they're viewing the world in a different way. It's amazing to me how quickly a lot of blind individuals will turn up the speed of a voice when they're using their iPhone. And I can't hear it. It's too fast for me to be able to hear. But at the same time, I'm thinking I can skim books because my virtual brain can do that. So it's really interesting, even just to spend time with somebody that has a disability of some sort, just to learn how they view the world a little differently, to see how you can change your own mind to think about how your branch. So to me, that would be, it doesn't have to be a branch, but connect with the people that were using the CNI building and listen to what they have to say about your building and what are some small things you can do. This is Derek that I'm talking about. He's talking about how I've never thought about it, but he's in the process of making tactile maps to go outside of washrooms, because if you're blind and go into a washroom, you have to touch everything in that washroom to be able to figure out where things are. But if he can make a tactile map for the outside of the washroom, he'll have an idea of where the toilets are, what side of the toilet paper is located. It's small little things like that. It's just amazing to me. So for me, that's my first step that I would do, is just to try to connect with the individuals that this is going to affect the most and see what you can do. Small little things that might change. I don't know if that was the expected answer, but that's what I do.
That's
This
great.
is Winona speaking. That's yeah. Rachel has just said in the chat, amazing answer, and I totally agree. The best learning opportunities I've had have come from people with disabilities. Sometimes it's come out of a complaint, so where I have been brought in to kind of understand what barrier the person has been experiencing, and then if I can form a connection with that person and listen really well, which is probably the key for my job. I feel like listening is something I need to work on too, but listen really well to what they're telling me and try to make improvements from their experiences. So for example, we've had someone who was having difficulty using assistive tech that we have in our space because it was configured in a really strange way. It wasn't configured in the way that he expected it and needed it to be configured. So from his frustration, I was able to sit down with him, and he was very patient and worked through it with me so that I could get a better sense of what was going on. And then I could share that with the IT team so that they could have their eyes open to what's happening on the ground in a way that they might not otherwise. So I think that learning from people with disabilities directly, if you have an opportunity to do that, it's absolutely the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I'll mention this year, one of our other issues that we have is that we can't go into care facilities like we had planned to do, right? So, yeah. But talking to people, they're like, well, no, you actually want to connect with the taxi services and the grocery stores and the places that people have to go to. Mm-hmm. We haven't been the best at it, but instead of, because somebody else said, sorry, I think it was Andre, mentioned connecting with healthcare providers. We're kind of finding that they're already super busy right now. So in our head, yeah, connect with our grocery stores that are delivering groceries, or the taxi services, because they're driving people around. Is there a way that we can connect with those need to have services. And I'll mention as well, we just had a comment yesterday with a lot of our online services have all of a sudden allowed their services to be accessed at home instead of forcing people to come to the library. So in this case, it was Grant Connect. And she said, it's so great because I have my assistive technology all set up at home. And so I can access Grant Connect at home.
Right.
But we know when this is over, all of a sudden they're going to have to come back to the library or so. And now all of a sudden her accessible, for us, we don't have her what she needs at the library for her to access Grant Connect. So it's something else for us to just think about, just from those personal connections that we.
Yeah.
That
I found that you kind of have to go to where people are, like elder care facilities, head trauma, concussion therapy places, places where you know those people will need those services, and the response is almost the same. Someone was saying here, like, now that the CNIB isn't providing those customers for us, but the thing is that everywhere we go, people are amazed at what we offer, and the first response is, "We didn't know you did that." Unfortunately, libraries are historically, I think, we're not great at marketing ourselves, and so the people are often completely amazed that we have things for them. Also, disabled people are an underserved population that has learned through negative reinforcement that they should expect less somehow, because there are so many barriers and so many places where people are not receiving adequate services, and so their expectations can be very low. So when you tell them that you have something specifically for them, they're usually quite grateful and very, very happy to know that there's a solution to their problem. So yeah, I find going to, and of course with the pandemic, that's been very, very hard to get the word out. So another huge challenge.
We've also tried to connect with the churches in town. I'm not sure how successful that is, but I know in some of our smaller branches, they'll have the most successful programs if it's announced in church. And that's how people will find out. So sometimes you've got to know, maybe it'll work in your community, maybe it won't. And sometimes it's just neighbors. So you even talking to our hearing customers and letting them know what's available, they can share it with neighbors that they have or people in there. Yeah.
Great. Good. I think this has been an excellent discussion, and I wanted to thank both Tara and Winona for coming today and sharing your experiences. I think I can base some comments on what Rachel said, in that I was taking notes furiously. I'll certainly listen to the recording, and we will be making this recording available for everybody. I think so takeaways for me in particular were the short sessions, the idea of making sure accessible training isn't just about accessibility, but is accessible itself. I think that's a huge takeaway. But I think we've all benefited from the work that both of you have told us about. And I think this was a really good learning experience. So again, thank you very much to both of you for speaking today.